Well, I know we've got some of our very own speakers dialing in from around the world. Jason, thanks for sharing that you're dialing in from DC today. We've got folks from, I know, Dubai, here in London, and elsewhere. So great to see a really large group starting to filter into the room. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kristen Coco, and I'm Vice President of External Affairs at the International Well Building Institute. And I'm excited to welcome you on behalf of both IWBI and Building Action to today's Climate Week 2023 webcast, Climate Change Demands Healthier and More Sustainable Buildings. Fortifying buildings for health has become a major priority as the building sector is confronted by a range of vulnerabilities, from indoor air quality to extreme heat waves. We've got some amazing speakers from across the public and private sectors today. Russ Carnahan, Adisha Sood, and Kevin Campshire. They've each got deep expertise and will be diving into these issues and discussing how the global real estate sector can take a leading role to address this challenge. With that, over to you, Jason.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristen. It's awesome to be here with everyone. I feel like this is our annual webcast with Building Action coinciding with Climate Week. And so it's good to get together with them and host this webcast. To get things started, it is my honor to introduce our opening speaker, former Congressman Russ Carnahan. From 2005 to 2013, Congressman Carnahan represented Missouri's 3rd Congressional District, which includes urban and rural areas in the St. Louis region. He served in a number of leadership roles, including senior Democratic whip. He was the co-chair of the bipartisan Center Aisle Caucus, and he was chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Organizations. But I think this audience will know him best by his longstanding work as a champion for better buildings. While in Congress, he supported numerous pieces of legislation focused on helping make our buildings safer, healthier, and more sustainable. And perhaps most notably, in a place where I was able to work closely with him, he founded and served as the co-chair of the High Performance Building Caucus on the House side. That's where he played a signature leadership role in recruiting colleagues to join the caucus and helping raise awareness among both members of Congress and the public about the critical role buildings play in combating climate change. Today, Congressman Carnahan is leading this building-focused coalition called Building Action, and we're proud to be partnering with Building Action on today's webcast. Let me turn it over now to Congressman Carnahan to tell us more about Building Action and the work he's leading. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Jason, it's great to be with you and team and the audience that's gathered here today. You know, I think back about that time often during the about 2008 time period, when there were a lot of conversations going on about energy and sustainability. And I was dumbfounded at the time how often buildings were not even mentioned, or if they were barely even mentioned in terms of overall addressing sustainability, climate, and energy issues. And as we all know, you can't have a serious conversation about global or national sustainability or energy if you don't include buildings. So post-Congress, partnered with Andrew Goldberg, and we co-founded the Building Action Coalition to really create a broader, better connected group of companies and organizations and individuals in the green building space, really focused on advocacy, focusing on our collective impact that we can have in this space. And the issues have not gotten less important, they've gotten more important and more impactful. And we've seen it as the climate impacts continue to grow, but also technology is beginning to fill in those gaps. And so between public sector and private sector, we've seen a great combination, and looking forward to this conversation today with the experts we have with us. And I'm really enthusiastic, but also inspired to see this action and ideas and innovation in this space that can really, really make a difference.
Congressman, Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I just want to take a second to kind of underscore what we heard and Congressman Carnahan's talking about this evolution. I love that line. You're exactly right. These issues are more pressing than they've ever been. In fact, the focus of today's webcast can be seen from the very pages of just about any newspaper in the country. In every community, in every corner of the country, we're getting beaten and battered by the escalating impacts of climate change. Climate change being what the WHO says is the greatest threat to human health. Kristen mentioned this, Congressman mentioned this, but from wildfires to flooding to extreme heat, buildings are now taking the brunt of the effects from more frequent, more intense weather events. And this has created a new dynamic where we need to be more focused on the question of how to protect the health of occupants inside our buildings. And so fortunately, we have leaders with us on this webcast who understand that fortifying buildings for health has become this major priority as the building sector is confronted by these increasing pressures and vulnerabilities. From the IWBI perspective, the WELL Building Standard provides a system for translating research into practice that allows us to share with our communities the strategies and solutions that prioritize people's health and well-being right now, but also in the context of a more challenging climate and against these climate change-driven health threats. It's also why we've created alignments with leading green building rating systems to better recognize projects that share a commitment to environmental sustainability with a commitment to human health. In fact, it's why we're particularly proud to have partnered up with the U.S. Green Building Council to roll out the new streamlined certification pathway for projects pursuing both LEED and WELL. It is so, so important. And in many respects, today's conversation is all about exploring how we demonstrate what I'd refer to as people plus planet leadership in our buildings. So with that, let me introduce our two wonderful panel guests. I don't have time to go into their bios, but they are very rich bios. And I can tell you that each is a distinguished leader in this space. We're thankful to have both of them with us. First, Adishesh Sood, who leads global strategic partnerships in the Sustainable Building Technologies division at Honeywell. Adishesh brings with him today a unique expert perspective on what's going on in markets around the world, as well as the role technology innovation is playing to help the building sector achieve success across really, really ambitious climate and health goals. So Adishesh, thanks for being with us today. Next, we have Kevin Campshire, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and the Director of the Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings at the General Services Administration. Of course, GSA is the largest landlord in the country, steward of hundreds, if not thousands of buildings. And Kevin is the person who for nearly 2 decades has been pioneering leadership efforts to create healthier, more sustainable, more resilient federal buildings. If you don't know Kevin and his work and his legacy, I'll just add that he is one of the most unsung heroes in government, helping deliver on the promise of better buildings. Kevin, thanks so much for being here with us today. So let's jump in. We've kind of laid out the premise, right? We're seeing this imperative emerge, the need for buildings that are fortified for health and sustainability. In that context, tell us a little bit about your work and how it supports better buildings, and how things have changed over the years in regards to how we prioritize health and sustainability. Adishesh, I thought we could start with you.
Sure, Jason. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an esteemed panel guest, and I think the topics that we're touching upon today are extremely important from both the health and sustainability side. From our perspective, we have a very unique position of technology leaders who are looking at both sides of the coin. We've looked at healthy buildings in the recent past. COVID-19 kind of forced everybody to look at it. And then sustainability has been at the heart of everything that we do, from sustainable aviation fuel to, let's say, sustainability in buildings per se, which is important today. So considering the fact that, sustainability in buildings has become important, not because sustainability is cutting across various industries, but because buildings are responsible for the largest emissions in the globe. From our standpoint, we've always believed that there's no planetary health or no human health separately. Both of them go hand in hand. All the solutions that we put into buildings, all of the consulting services or the important trusted advisor role that we play with our customers is towards the fact that we know the balance between the both, and we understand that outcomes that are delivered by one benefits the other and vice versa. So all of the technology that we look at is not a single narrative of let's save energy, let's look at energy efficiency. It's also towards let's look at a whole soul sustainability picture of where does the social element come in from? How do we balance occupant health, etc.? And then we get into the field of sustainability and look at a holistic picture of a particular building. So I think our perspective from a technologist standpoint is towards looking at innovative solutions that have people talking in the same breath about both things. They don't have to separately look at it. And also the point that it's not wildfires or it's not special events that have to spur conversations about sustainability or building health. If building health was important 2 years ago because COVID-19 was around, it's as important as it was at then that point as well. So it's not, nothing has to change, or the narrative doesn't need to keep changing from time to time. We've always believed to that, and we've kept our innovative strategy according to that.
Well said. Kevin.
Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with my two panelists here. I remember when I got started in this was 1984, when we were investigating why people were getting sick in a building in Washington, D.C. It was the first time that the Centers for Disease Control had ever documented in a rigorous way what constituted sick building syndrome. And sick building syndrome really taught me in this building, also, talking to the people who were being taken to Johns Hopkins with serious respiratory illnesses, that buildings could harm people's health. And I think it's worth remembering that we started out just focusing on getting rid of the toxins in buildings. We got rid of asbestos in buildings. We got rid of volatile organic compounds and so on and so forth. And we really focused on just getting the stuff that was killing people out of the buildings. Then we moved to an era of really saying, well, how could we improve building operations? And that's where the energy movement came to the forefront. We started bringing good quality materials in the building that didn't off-gas, so we didn't have to remediate the off-gassing. I remember there was a saying before that, as soon as the building is ready for occupancy, don't put the people in it, because you got to let the building get rid of its toxins for at least 2 to 3 weeks before people came in. Of course, we never listened to that advice. We always put the people in the building before the toxins were out. Now we've moved to what I think is the most exciting time, which is really a focus on how buildings can not just not harm people, but how can they actually improve the health well-being of the occupants of the building and the users of the building. How can buildings be a part of the community? How can they be places of refuge? How can, in our portfolio, how can office buildings provide protection for people who may need it in the community? And we're really looking into that. We have shown through research that we can make positive changes in the building that will affect the health of occupants, their physical well-being. We can improve their sleep patterns. We can change their ability to be alert during the day. We can improve their ability to think clearly. And all of this is through good scientific research. And we find in a lot of cases that these interventions don't cost an arm and a leg. They're just doing things differently than the way we did before. And now, of course, we're looking at the new frontier is all that embodied carbon. I just mentioned that, buildings are the biggest component. That's operational carbon, but they're also a huge component of embodied carbon. Concrete alone, which of course we also use for highways, but still, and that reminds me to echo what Congressman Carnahan said earlier. People forget about buildings. I remember during the passage of the American Recovery Act that I had to keep repeating, remember, buildings are infrastructure too. It's not just bridges and roads. And buildings are infrastructure too, and they're a huge component of infrastructure. So I'm very excited by where we are today in the thought that we can use buildings to help the health and well-being as the WHO defines well-being, not just the absence of sickness, but the presence of positive health.
Here. I love that kind of that background overlay to this conversation, Kevin. So thank you. It definitely aligns with kind of how I see things have been playing out too. I mean, in the last 10 years, I think global real estate really has stepped up and worked overtime to do its part to support rapid decarbonization. And from a mitigation standpoint, we're seeing widespread adoption of energy efficiency solutions and other carbon reduction strategies. But, because of an already changing climate, the world is becoming more inhospitable. And I was struck by what former NASA climate scientist James Hansen said recently. We are headed wittingly into this new reality. We knew it was coming. Things will get worse before they get better. So with that, and from your perspective, what does this mean for buildings? These are the places that first and foremost need to protect occupants, keep us safe. Are buildings ready? Are they prepared? Kevin, back to you.
In a word, a little, but mostly no. Buildings are not ready, they're not prepared. We built a lot of buildings where windows don't open. Who would have a home that window doesn't open? I'm on the 28th floor of a hotel room in New York right now. The window opens. I don't know any office building where the window opens on the 6th floor, forget the 28th floor. And so little things like that, the presence of natural daylight, we've been so focused on the cost effectiveness and the profit motive of buildings that we've forgotten that the human cost is the one that needs to be moved up in the decision-making priority, and that's an issue that we have to deal with. So buildings are moving in that direction. I think people understand it, but clearly the process of electrification of buildings and decarbonization of buildings is a huge multi-trillion-dollar issue for the globe. Maybe more than multi-trillion. I don't know what comes after a trillion, a quadrillion. But it's a lot of money that we need to focus, and it doesn't get alone, because we've got to not only modernize buildings, get buildings prepared, the grid has to change. The grid has to change all around the world, well, including the places where there's no grid. So we need to really be focused, and that may be the great opportunity, is to focus on those areas of the world where we can take everything we've learned and done wrong and do it right, and do it right this time as somebody else's coin. So long way to go, but steps in the right direction. I think that the problem is, as Dr. Hansen would echo, the steps have been too small and too slow, and we need to take bigger steps and start running.
Thank you. Adishesh.
I think it's just a continuation of what Kevin was just saying, right? So one, I think that sense of urgency is extremely important, right? There's sense of urgency, stimulus funding, government push in certain sections of the society, certain countries of the world. That push or that drive is probably absent in many portions of the globe as well. I think there needs to be uniformity in the actions that we are performing. Governments probably talk to each other more often and say, what everybody is doing for climate change needs to be, brought up to speed to each other as well. The other thing is, again, bringing in that technologist angle. I think Kevin briefly touched upon the fact that, there's a lot of concentration on the profitability of buildings. So there obviously has to be, technology that kicks in and says, you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. The trade-off is not a given. So let's say if there's the hotel room on the 28th floor of a hotel where Kevin is at the moment, If there are 3 people there, then the parameters of that particular room should be adjusted for those 3 people. There are technologies who can look at occupancy versus how your lighting should be, how the energy can be saved in terms of HVAC. You can run schedules on a particular building looking at occupancy levels, for example. So I think there needs to be a recipe where you stop thinking about the trade-off. And it also kind of brings me back to lead plus well, for example. If there are frameworks which give you that prescriptive medicine of this is how you can do it together, and one will lead to the other, I think that becomes important. That is probably what the industry and the building owners need today. The other thing is, I think Kevin also touched upon briefly on the issue of resilience, right? When you look at grid electrification, when you look at electrification, when you look at grid resilience, systems like battery energy storage, right, which can help with carbon reduction. Stuff like bringing on more EV cars. And again, EV cars are fancy, they're very nice to have, but can the grid handle all of that electricity that goes back to the grid? We hear that selling electricity back to the grid from EV charging networks is a big thing right now. It's slowly growing, and probably the grid isn't ready to handle it, or you don't need that much of excess energy. So I think there are various steps that we can take, but they've got to be fast. Going back to my first point, that sense of urgency is probably the most important.
Adishish, I really appreciate that, because the urgency question is one that's should be front and center. And Kevin saying we're moving too slow, we have to infuse, I think, our policymakers with some of that urgency, and folks like Congressman Carnahan have gotten that and have moved on this and helped put the building policy issue on the map. And then also that our problems are multifaceted. So our solutions have to be grappling with multiple issues. And I really do think the climate resilience solutions are also human health resilient solutions. So there's a lot of synergy there. I want to get back to a couple of the basics, though, right? I mean, we say this all the time. People spend 90% of their lives in buildings. I've said this a million times, but every time I say it, it amazes me. We spend 90% of our time inside buildings. And then there's a subsequent stat that you have to attach to the second part of this, and that is that on average, indoor air is 2 to 5 times worse than outdoor air, and as high as 100 times worse, according to the EPA. And one of the things that I think is interesting in the moment where we're in, and it comes back to your point on urgency, is that more so than any other administration, at least from dating back to the Clinton administration, I think this administration, the Biden administration, gets the implication of those two stats. This administration has made healthy buildings a huge priority for advancing positive health outcomes. And they see it both as a health strategy and a preparedness strategy in the event of future health threats. Early on, the administration pointed to healthy building strategy as a key tenet in its national COVID preparedness plan. And then, Kevin, you and I were together for the first ever White House summit on indoor air quality. I mean, what a seismic event that was. I mean, I don't think any of us anticipated the White House rallying around, the importance of healthy buildings and in particular, indoor air quality. And then, of course, the administration followed it up with rolling out its Clean Air in Buildings Challenge. So, Kevin, I want to put that administrative activity in context. I think a lot of that leadership we're seeing has benefited from the foundational, long-standing work GSA has led to elevate the health and buildings conversation, including some important research efforts that I know you've supported directly. But talk to us a little bit about those various efforts at GSA, including the work you're leading to ensure that federal buildings are adopting these evidence-based best practices that support the dual aspiration of protecting the environment and advancing human health.
I think you're absolutely right. First of all, the idea that we should be really thinking about buildings and their effect on human health from a scientific basis is it's relatively new, honestly. A lot of the work on human health in buildings in the past was really based on intuition. People made assertions, and the assertions became accepted. You know, there are assertions about how people react to temperature, how people react to all kinds of other things that we're finding through our research is not actually representative. And it's because some of the research dates back to the 50s, when the demographics of the workforce were hugely different than they are today. In the 50s, some of us will recall, maybe I'm the only one on the panel who really can recall the 50s, but the workforce was, in the United States at least, was predominantly white and predominantly male. And it's not that way anymore. It's much more diverse. It's much more gender diverse, racially diverse, and nationally diverse. And so as a result, we have very, very different metabolisms in the building, very, very different behaviors in the building. And the science is showing us that what we need to do is we need to build buildings that are much more flexible than they used to be, that have, you know, and Adisha mentioned this earlier, control systems that are much more responsive to what's actually going on in the building. We find that, you know, the science is teaching us that in lots of the buildings we're over-ventilating and wasting energy, but in other parts of the building we're under-ventilating and impairing both health and cognitive performance. So we need to get the right conditions to the right places in the building where the people are, which means we have to know where the people are and when they're coming. And this has been really massively complicated by the change that COVID has brought in the way people work and where people work and how they work. It used to be that all we used to think about in research was, well, what's the difference between working in a coffee shop versus working in the office? Because those were the two options. But now there's so many options where people work. And what we as, and this is what I think the Biden administration has really done from the very, very beginning, is they've started from a, what are we trying to do for the people who work for the government? How are we trying to help them serve the nation in the best possible way? And the way we do that is by providing them a good, healthy place to work that really does that. And we saw that with all of the meticulous work on how is respiratory illness being transmitted, how is it working in buildings, and all of the scientific debate that was going on, but also a lot of the improvements that we made and the very, very quick shifting. I mean, we started, people will remember, but people, maybe they won't remember, we started out thinking that COVID was probably transmitted by touching, you know, and so we cleaned surfaces and we spent lots of money on bleach, which we shouldn't have. And then it turns out that once we got the scientific knowledge and we knew how the transmission was going, how do we do that and we do much better? And that's what we're doing now. And now we're trying to, the challenge that you mentioned, Jason, is one that GSA is participating in, because we have buildings and we have, fortunately, we've done, you know, 68 buildings and they're meeting the requirements that are the minimum standards that both the CDC and that ASHRAE are setting out. And we're working to really expand that and saying, well, how do we really fine tune that and get to what Adisha said? We don't need to make an either or choice. We can have a both and solution. And in fact, like a lot of things, if you really, really delve into it, you find that by putting the money in the wrong places, we're wasting it. And if you take all of that waste, you can actually afford to do the right thing all of the time for all of the people.
I really like that. And, you know, I think we should, you know, get to what you were bridging into, Kevin, a little bit. And that is what one of my colleagues likes to say is making the invisible in the building visible, and kind of what's the role of technology. You know, how do you support continuous monitoring and performance across these key indoor environmental quality metrics like air quality, water quality, thermal comfort, acoustics, lighting, and the list goes on. Adishesh, you know, you're the expert here in this space on how these technologies are being used and how these new advancements for measuring and monitoring building performance are helping kind of get at the crux of what can be very complicated and making it much simpler for end users. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you're helping kind of support integrated solutions?
100%. So I think the first few words of how I summarize what you just said was what gets measured gets managed. Unless you know what's on your screen, you really won't be able to kind of pinpoint where the problem lies. I think sensory technology took a flight worth 10 years, maybe during COVID. Sensors that we'd never known about came out and became extremely popular on the market to the extent that a lot of technology providers like us started believing that this was a commodity in the market now. There wasn't just a particular air quality sensor. But when you look at the problem that we are addressing here of complexity in a particular building environment, I think what's important to notice is now not how bespoke systems work, not how a HVAC system works or how a lighting system works. But the most important point is, one, always knowing how the system's performing, and two, how are these systems talking to each other? That's the most important piece. Until and unless you've got an integrated ecosystem of systems, to sound, at the cost of sounding redundant here, until and unless you have a system of systems which connects all of these to each other, which helps to work the building in concert, that's what gives you real data. One, your buildings should be able to tell you what's going to fail in advance. Predictive maintenance is something that's been around for the longest time. I think it's about time that we start using it effectively. Start looking at how parameters like indoor air quality, not alone, but also with bad lighting in the same area, affect a particular human being. Not the point that buildings are consuming too much energy, but are they consuming too much energy because you unfortunately have a 15-year-old chiller in the building, right? So it's also about looking at various other factors of how your building is being maintenance practices, best practices from various different rating systems. If I was in Australia last year, they've got this rating system called Neighbors, which kind of looks at how you compare buildings with each other. So it's like a percentile rating, right? One building's always performing in relationship to the other. So it's like you're always comparing, you're always measuring, you're always trying to make your systems talk to each other. You're always trying to better yourself, right? And I'm not saying that's a particular benchmark or a rating system is better than the other, but I think it's important to notice that when you have prescriptive frameworks, when you have systems of systems, when you have sensory technology, it becomes very easy to start pinpointing how the building can get better. And then you start adding these layers of how can I make it more resilient? How do I put better energy sources? How do I put green power in? And then it becomes a whole soul story. So I think from a technology standpoint, it's becoming easier by the day because more and more technology providers like Honeywell are thinking about it. But I think it's also important that as people in this particular realm of experience, we need to tell and educate stakeholders at various levels. It's our responsibility as well to present these solutions and bring building owners up to speed for that matter.
Adishesh, a quick follow-up of one of the questions that have kind of come in through, I think, the chat. The way that the U.S. is kind of moving forward to promote health and sustainable buildings as compared to the EU or other regions. Any comment there, or is it similar? Are there some divergence in approaches? Just curious, because you do have a really interesting global perspective.
So I think from exactly from a health and well-being standpoint plus planetary health, I think there are, I wouldn't say equal efforts, but there is comparable effort between the European Union and the US government, right? You've got the likes of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has billions of dollars into sustainability. The Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, the IIJ in the past had a lot of provisions that were extended by the IRA, specifically looking at 179D and all of the energy efficiency stuff that's happening in buildings at the moment. we are looking at better building performance standards in the United States as well. So I think there's a lot happening in the US. As soon as you flip over to the EU, resilience and recovery funds were the first to come in the EU, right? They're looking at the EU Green Deal, which is revamping hundreds and centuries old architecture, looking at how to modernize it without destroying the real essence of the architecture there, right? So I think there's comparable effort. The governments are looking at one, becoming indigenous. We know there's a lot of warlike situation on various borders of the European Union, and they are looking at becoming indigenous. Germany won't be able to stay in the dark for the longest time. They are looking at sudden heat waves. France or Switzerland was never that hot. It's starting to become hot now. So they obviously have governments looking at stuff like electrification. Heat pumps are becoming a rage in Europe as well. There's smart thermostats which are coming on. We've been asked to present our solutions accordingly, saying how do we battle this new rage of climate that's coming our way. So I think there's comparable efforts. If I was to look at one compared to the other, I wouldn't say the one is faster than the other either, because there's a lot of work that goes into building this policy and kind of implementing it. But I think both are heading in the right direction and kind of helping all of the building owners get to the point where they can start reporting better ESG metrics.
That's great. Good to see some convergence there. Kind of on a similar vein here, Congressman Carnahan, I'd love for you to share your thoughts about ways that all of us should be thinking about policy opportunities and ways we can advocate and support sound policies to help us move faster. We've gotten through a period of incredible policy making. There's a lot of investment that the federal government has made. But sometimes there is a distinction between whether it's sustainability investments or health investments, or sometimes both. And then, as I recall, during our last webcast together, we had Congressman Beyer on, who talked a lot about the bill that he had introduced, the Airborne Act, which was in many respects, a seminal bill that would provide financial incentives to businesses that deployed solutions to improve indoor air quality. So, we are seeing kind of, a convergence between sustainability and health policy, but we're also seeing more distinct health building policy bubble up as well on its own. Just curious if you have some thoughts about, generally about some of these policy opportunities and kind of how advocates and organizations and companies should think about those policy opportunities.
Yeah, well, thank you, and really appreciate Kevin and Adishesh's comments. The one thing I want to just be sure and say out loud is just acknowledge, the federal government obviously is the biggest owner and operator of buildings, has a tremendous influence in terms of just their size, setting industry standards, and how things are done in the market. But on top of that, the Biden administration is, and the Congress have put out historic amounts of funding to help accelerate some of these things, to actually get them out there and get them deployed. And so there are a big round of opportunities there. And it's also meant to partner with the private sector companies that are doing a lot of the innovation in these spaces. So it's a real convergence, I think, of seeing that historic levels of federal government funding with historic engagement and innovation from the private sector. So again, I think that's a tremendous, powerful force going on in the market right now. The other is, and it certainly was accelerated with COVID, is, how do you deal with public spaces? If you're a government building or a hotel or a theater or a grocery store, and you've got a bunch of folks coming into your building, how are you keeping those people safe? And there's a lot of technologies right on the cutting edge of that, screening people going into buildings or monitoring, but, spaces in buildings where they can identify, risk factors that are airborne, that are, I think, really going to take off here. And then the last point I want to make is, often we're thinking about, what we're doing with new buildings, but the bulk of the buildings that are already built are still going to be around for decades to come. And so we really have to have in our strategy, and a way to look at retrofitting existing buildings as ways that really could make a difference and move the needle. So those are some of the areas where I think there's real opportunity. And for folks that are out there, kind of depending on where you're coming from, if you're in the commercial space or residential space, or you're in the public sector, there are many, many ways to engage in this through associations. Building Action has taken this on as a clause and a calling, because we think there's really, by organizing and having this diverse, better connected group in the building space, that we can really make a difference with policymakers and really sharing information between experts in the field. But that's going to really help us move the needle. So that's why the conversations like this, to me, are so important.
They are. I appreciate the laying it all out there for us too, because the federal policy space has really grown, and I think that's and a lot more interest. And again, it really comes back to even the caucus that you formed specific to sustainable, healthy buildings. So again, it started back then and has.
And one thing I might add, Jason, I think is super important, especially when we have divided government politically. One of the things we found is often the folks in the business sector who maybe not come into this space thinking in a big way about environment or sustainability. They've really come to look at many of these things as just good for their business, good for their brand, good for their bottom line. It's just good business for them to be, improving their building and their sustainability practices. So that's been a big shift that we've seen in recent years. It's frankly made the ability for a lot of these issues to be more bipartisan, to have the business sector really engaged in this.
That's a big one. Maybe we stop there for a second and just, I'd love to open that up to the other panelists. The economic case for energy improvements, for instance, those are fairly black and white, but we're now starting to get some of the economic analysis based on what it means to advance a healthy building. We know that there are rent premiums that are sizable. We know that lease terms are longer. We know that Kevin, you suggested this earlier, but we know there are big improvements in terms of productivity. In fact, one study showed that you could boost productivity up to $7,500 per person in your organization per year. I mean, that's huge. Maybe Adish, I should start with you because you're in the field and you're in kind of how businesses are approaching this. But are they starting to kind of put the business case on the sustainable building side together with the business case on the health side together and really get a better understanding of how those work together?
Yeah, then if you'd asked me that question in 2020, I would have said it's lopsided towards healthy buildings. You're asking me this in 2023, and I'd have to say it's lopsided towards the sustainable buildings piece, because I think it's it's not scary, but it's surprising, because it wasn't supposed to be separate. It was always supposed to be one. Right, yes. One was supposed to fuel the other. And what we kind of, and as industry, I think we've lost focus of the point that sustainability contains all of the metrics. It's the social impact, it's occupant health, it's energy efficiency, it's resilience, it's all of that. It's not just one. So I think currently, yes, the narrative is very focused on sustainability. It's very focused on energy efficiency. With the advent of technology towards those sides, I think businesses are approaching it from a sustainable side. But as soon as they begin their journey, as soon as they start talking about ESG, which is more than a buzzword at the moment, it's becoming a reality slowly and gradually. Financial institutions are asking you to quote ESG metrics. When you go for a loan, you get lower interest rates or you get a green loan, for example, if you are a good ESG provider. And that has everything. That has social and governance as well. It's not only about the E. So I think as far as environmental was important, it's kind of lost its touch a little bit to sustainability. But at the same time, as soon as intelligent organizations embark on their journey, they understand that it's not going to cut it just looking at the environmental piece. It has to be the social and governance as well. I think it is absolutely difficult to remove healthy buildings from this conversation. I don't think it should be done. I don't think organizations are doing it even. It's just that they want to begin at a different point as they would 2 years ago.
Kevin, what about you? What are you seeing?
Well, I guess what we're seeing, first of all, in our dealings with the private sector, we sort of set the expectations pretty clearly. And I think what we're seeing in the marketplace in general is that the tenants are setting expectations that are different than they were a decade ago. I'm not so sure what's happened in the last couple of years, but I think in the last couple of years, what we have is a beyond radical shift in the balance of power between the landlords and the tenants, because in so many cities across the United States and across Northern Europe, people are working elsewhere than the office building. They're working elsewhere than the building. They're working in their homes. They're working in the condos and so on and so forth. So that vacancy has made the landlord's desire, I think, how do you distinguish my property from the one next door? Mine's healthier. I'll protect you more. I will provide you shelter in a way. And I think that kind of market differentiation is one thing. I also think that that as we make this shift, there's going to be a shift in sort of the financial underpinning, and we'll have many, many fewer single-purpose buildings, maybe with the exception of hospitals, and many more multi-purpose buildings serving, retail and healthcare and residential and offices all in the same building in a way that is more vibrant for the city, but also provides a better life for the occupants in those buildings. So I think that's the big shift that we're seeing, and I hope it continues in that direction. But I think we're also at this sort of question mark of an inflection point. It's like, where will it go? Will we all retreat to the suburbs, or will we come back in there? And I think the cities are still attracting people to live there, but the landlords need to adjust the business model to the new reality, and the new reality is we're not going back to the way it was in 2020.
Yeah, definitely. And more, there's more flexibility. There's more of a hybrid approach. I think it's here to stay. But, it's interesting, the kind of your opening about this, there is, I think, much more emphasis on kind of this flight to quality. And what do building owners and managers think about in terms of flight to quality? And I think health and well-being is much more prioritized than it has been, and it's almost institutionalized. So it's something that is coming up in every conversation. Interestingly enough, we did a workplace well-being poll that found that health concerns coming back to the office, for those who were coming back, in the total across an aggregate series of health concerns equaled the concerns related to the commute. So that's pretty sizable. That means that health is a significant factor. I want to get back to one other question that's kind of the implementation question, and there's this there is this old conventional wisdom that if you're advancing environmental health and human health together, that there, particularly on the energy side of this, that they may be in conflict. Adishesh, I think we'd be remiss without letting you address that directly, because you talked a lot about how planetary health and human health go hand in hand. But what are you seeing in practice? Is that the case, or are you seeing cases and data that show differently? Are we able to overcome that and pursue the two together?
I think it's spotty at the moment, Jason. There's a lot of belief that yes, it should go together. There's a lot of saying things. There's a lot of committing to carbon neutral. There's a lot of commitment. But I think the conversion or translation into action is slow. And that's why I brought up urgency earlier, right? I think planetary health is not something which is directly under the control of a particular building. It's a collective effort. So that one kind of takes time to digest and move forward. The occupant health piece, I think people have become wise over a period of time. And hence, I think the survey reported that commute and indoor health was equally important to people coming back to office because people know more now. COVID-19's made a scientist of everyone. But I think the implementation of planetary plus human is something that needs a lot of coaching and counseling. It's not something that people will believe almost immediately. It's something that people will need technology to support. It is something that people will look at the benefit of the bottom line first, because energy efficiency is that bottom line adder, and then start looking at, okay, can I get further even substantial benefit when I start looking at human health as well, under my roof. So I think the adoption is slow, I would say, but coming back again to structures like LEED plus well, right? The adoption of both the standards has been immense over a period of time. And I think when you have structures like that in place, those structures and those prescriptive, certification standards speak to the diaspora directly. They're like, here you go. The industry believes that these go hand in hand. It's a living example that two organizations have gotten together who are at the leading forefront of both of these movements, who believe that, yes, one will benefit the other and will move hand in hand. So I think we need more work to go in, and we need to keep pushing the envelope on, yes, this goes hand in hand. And I think the advent of standards like LEED plus well will take it even further.
All right, we're getting to the last few minutes here, and so I want to go around each of the three panelists with a question that I'd kind of like to end on, and maybe give each of you about a minute to respond. And we've talked a lot about this convergence of solutions, right? We need solutions that are going to be able to hit across the values that we want our buildings to reflect, right? We want our buildings to be leaders in climate. We want them to be climate resilient. We absolutely want them to be leaders in terms of human health and well-being. And so we ask a lot of our buildings, as we should. So what is one thing that we need to kind of win on that thesis? What, is one policy, one behavioral change, one, certain technology package that we need to advance? What's the one thing that you would point to that helps us get to where we need to go? Kevin, you want to jump in, maybe go first?
I think it's impossible to say one thing, so I'm going to say two, just because I have to.
Rules are meant to be broken.
We absolutely have to decarbonize buildings quickly, systematically, and everywhere. And that means the grid, that means the buildings, that means massive electrification. That's something we can do now. The technology exists. It's not perfect, and it's getting better. And the more we do it, the better we'll get at it. The other thing that we need to do is remember that we're doing this for the purpose of protecting and supporting the people who use whatever building it is. And again, you can't prioritize ventilation over light. You have to do everything all the time, because people are complex. Our bodies are really require a great deal of care and feeding, and we need to provide that in all the ways that it manifests. And we're learning as we go, and we just get better and better, but we have to do that. And those two things have to be the two imperatives going forward.
Love it. Thanks, Kevin. Adishesh.
So I think I'll continue to break the rule. I think there has to be two things or more maybe. But I think you have to look at creating functional buildings, built to purpose. Look at where people in communities will thrive. Look at what brings collaboration. Look at design that's more efficient. And I don't know if there must be a lot of people in the audience who've read The Fountainhead. It happens to be my favorite book. If you haven't read it, you have to. You'll get that sense of what buildings can do for you, and you'll know how important architectural design is. And I know there are existing buildings that we are also tackling, and that would be the second part of my answer. I think while you're looking at building functional, communal, collaborative designed buildings, also start looking at what's the 80-20 in the building? What are those top two problems that would help you to become energy efficient? That leads to decarbonization. Don't look at boiling the ocean. Don't replace all your lights and just of the off of whims and fancies of sustainability. Start looking at the 80-20. Look at the more important things that you can do.
And existing buildings, absolutely. All right, Congressman, you have 1 minute to take us home.
If I have to pick one thing, I would say getting to a common acceptance of evaluation and rating buildings, whether you're a buyer or seller in a real estate transaction, or a landlord tenant in that situation, or employer employee, so that the market bargain between those entities, we raise the level and people can see, oh, that part of that bargain, part of the conversation is we know what the rating and evaluation of this building is that has value in the transaction. And to me, that would change a lot of these conversations, having that common accepted standard. And I know you all are working on that, but to me, that's a big one that cuts across a lot of areas.
These leadership frameworks are so critical. Well, on behalf of Kristen and all of us at IWBI, on behalf of our friends and partners at Building Action, I just want to say thank you to all of you. Congressman Carnahan, it was a pleasure to have you on the panel with us. Kevin, thank you for your leadership and work. Adishesh, great to have your insight and perspective on today's session. Thank you, everyone. This concludes our webcast. Thank you for joining us.